Okay, welcome back everybody. Today we're going to be talking about deep water systems, and we'll start off with a review of deep water processes and how they're arranged within typical fasces models. So again, we're going to refer back to these models, these standard sequence stratigraphic models that we introduced on the first day of the course. Here's one with a shelf, a slope and basin floor. And we're thinking here about these deposits in brown and the dark grey. So basin floor fans and slope fans, and obviously they require that those can't form in basins with a ramp margin. We require deep bathymetry to generate sandstones and other types of deposits in deep water. So if we have kind of one mental image of a deep water fan system, what would it be? Something like this. So here's the shelf, here's the slope, and here's the basin floor. We have to get sediment out to the basin floor somehow, and typically that occurs through a canyon system, and that canyon acts as the feeder for sediment further out into the basin. That canyon can be connected with deltas or other kinds of shoreline on the shelf. There are also times when those deltas and shorelines build out to the shelf edge. That also helps to promote delivery of sediment to deep water. We have a channel on the slope that, again, that can be confined. It can occur within the canyon, or in systems that don't have canyons, those channels can also run down the slope too. That slope channel is sort of the trunk feeder system. As we pass further down dip into the basin, we see that channel can split, and it can have lobes, sometimes referred to as frontal splays, at the end, the downstream termination of those channels. And to make sort of one point here quickly that we'll come back to, there's a hierarchy of these deposits in the same way as there are in other different depositional environments. So in the shallow marine environment, we talked about beds, we talked about fasces and fasces belts, how they're arranged within parasequences, how the parasequences are stacked into bigger units. Exactly the same principles apply in deep water deposits. We can think about individual beds of different types. We think about how those stack into bigger units. And typically, stacks of beds have a certain geometry. They define geometrical elements. Those elements, it would include channels, for example, and they can also be stacked up. And those elements have a certain sort of spatial distribution with respect to each other. And one common example is that channels, they split and get smaller in a downstream direction, but those channels also feed lobes or frontal splays. And these kinds of depositional systems can also be stacked to form bigger successions of strata. Okay, so let's start off at the bed scale, and this is a scale in which we can think about the processes that deposit deep water sandstones and other lithologies. And really the key thing here is gravity flows. We're talking about mixtures of sediments and water moving down a slope, and it's gravity that drives that movement. So there are four sort of main types that I'm going to review here quickly. The first of these are slides. So you can think about these as being blocks of coherent sediment which have faults at the up dip end and faults at their down dip end. And these blocks, they move along a basal slip surface. So this is shown by this arrow in here. We have this block moving down a slope. So slides, the key thing about slides is they have relatively little internal deformation. And where we do see internal deformation, we're seeing faults. Those faults tell us that that deformation is brittle. Okay. So this would be a slide. Now, closely linked to that, we have our second category, slumps. Now, in this case, again, we have material moving down a slope. That material starts off, it moves from an area which the area that's left behind we can refer to as a slump scar. And that material moves down the slope. It stays as a relatively coherent mass, but internally you can see some faults, but more commonly folds. So the folds tell us we have ductile deformation, and they are the key features in slumps. So slumps and slides are quite similar. The difference is that slumps have ductile deformation, folds internally. Slides have brittle deformation, faults internally. These two categories are not completely distinct from each other. Slides can change into slumps, for example, as material moves down a slope. And often we group slides and slumps together into a category called mass transport deposits or mass transport complexes. Here's an example of a slump. There's a person there for scale and a car there for scale. The lower half of this cliff face is about 15 meters in height, and you can see the beds are folded over. And that tells us ductile deformation in a slump. Okay, so the two other types of flow and associated beds that we see are debris flows at the top here and turbidity currents at the bottom of this table in here. So this table has names, the names of different types of event beds, of gravity flow beds on the left. In the center, we have a cartoon showing the structure within that flow as it moves down a slope. Here, this third column shows the types of beds which result from that flow process. And on the far right-hand side, we have the behavior. This is basically the way that within the flow we see, as we go from the base of the flow upwards, how the velocity changes within the flow. There's lots of detail in this table. I'm just going to focus on two main types of flow: debris flows and turbidity currents. So debris flows, they are cohesive. They have some internal strength. And what that means is we see a kind of flow within them termed laminar flow. If you look on this right-hand side in here, we can see a graph showing how the velocity changes within the flow. So velocity is 0 on the left and it increases towards the right. And the base of the flow here is the bottom of this vertical axis. As we move up, we're moving towards the top of the flow. The key thing here is, the velocity is 0 at the bed itself, at the base of the flow in here. That's because there's friction at the bed. But as we move up, the velocity rapidly increases, and then the velocity stays uniform within the flow. That's within the main body of the flow here. That uniform velocity is what we refer to as laminar flow. What it means is we don't have the potential to mix the different layers within the flow. They stay separate from each other. That means we don't, for example, sort material. The grain size stays uniform. We can mix up the grain sizes, but we don't develop upward fining or upward coarsening. It also means we don't develop ripples or dunes. They require some turbulence within the flow, and that's missing in debris flows. So the deposit that we're left with is shown in here. The bed has a sharp base, but the bed has a uniform internal character. and it's essentially structureless. There's no change in grain size from base to top. There are no sedimentary structures developed. All we see is this sort of mixture of grains that reflect what the material we started with, and that they're poorly sorted. Okay, at the bottom here we have a turbidity current. So this is our other opposite end member for these types of gravity flow. Here's a picture of that flow moving down a slope, and what you can see in here is that these arrows are indicating there's turbulence within the flow. The flow is mixing, it's maybe pulling in water from the surrounding ocean or lake and mixing that water into the flow itself. And if we look at a profile of how the velocity changes from the base of the flow to the top, that's what's shown in the bottom right in here. So again, velocity increasing from 0 on the left to an increasing towards the right. And how that velocity changes as we go from the base of the flow upwards towards the top. So again, at the bed itself, the velocity is 0. Again, that's friction at the bed, which is giving us that effect. And then the velocity increases rapidly to the right, but then you can see the velocity within the flow is not uniform. Different parts of the flow move in different velocities. And that difference in velocity causes mixing within the flow, turbulence within the flow. That means that we can sort the sediment. It means we can develop bed forms like ripples and dunes. And it means we can develop grading, changes in grain size vertically within the resulting bed. And that's what this cartoon here is showing. The base of the bed is sharp. It's overlain by relatively coarse grained sediment that gets finer upwards. And then there's a certain characteristic set of sedimentary structures within here. And this characteristic set of sedimentary structures, this is what we refer to as the Balmer sequence. So the bottom part of the flow, that's the A division, is structureless. Then the B division is flat laminated, but those flat laminations record a high velocity. That's the B division. The C division here is characterized by ripples. So that represents a decrease in velocity. Then the D division is parallel laminated, but typically silts. They record low velocity. So again, the velocity is decreasing upwards. And then the top of the bed is capped by mudstone, and that is the E division of the Balmer sequence. So we get this upward decrease in grain size, and we get a vertical succession of sedimentary structures that record a change from high velocity to low velocity. So let me show you some examples of this. So here's some examples of debris flows. So here's the base of one debris flow. It looks rather it's a sort of a rather planar erosional surface. The base of a second debris flow around where the pen is. The first debris flow is sandy, and you can't really see much internal structure in there because the grains are all similar grain size. This second flow in here is characterized by a mixture of pebbles, sand grains, some finer material, all mixed in together and without any internal structure. So again, that's characteristic of a debris flow. Okay, let me skip back a couple of slides. I skimmed over some of these flow types which are in between low density turbidity currents and debris flows. And these flows in here, they show a mixture of characteristics that are somewhere in between low density turbidity currents and these cohesive debris flows. So we get what are referred to as high density turbidity currents. So these are turbidity currents with an awful lot of sand and sediment in them. And that high concentration of sediment tends to damp down the turbulence in the flow. We also see categories of flow, slurry flow or cogenetic flows, sometimes referred to as linked debrites. These are terms you may have come across previously. These are flows that switch their behavior. Sometimes they behave as turbidity currents, sometimes they behave as debris flows. And that change in the behavior is caused by deposition as the flow moves. So that would be loss of sediment, or erosion picking up more sediment and incorporating more sediment, and also incorporating more water into the flow. And as the ratio between sediment and water changes once the flow is moving, that determines whether the flow is behaving in a turbulent manner or in a laminar manner. So this example here is showing there's an erosion surface here above this this trowel, and then part of a very thick flow which is about 1.5 meters in thickness. So we have coarser material at the base and then fining upwards into sand. So that is indicative of turbidity currents, that graded bedding. We also have some large boulders kind of carried in the matrix of sandstone, and that's characteristic of debris flows. So this bedding here is showing a mixture of characteristics of both classical turbidites and debris flows. It's very sandy, so this is interpreted as being an example of a high density turbidity current. Okay, this picture here is showing, in some ways, more typical classical turbidites, low density turbidites. There's two thin beds in here, this one here, this lower one below, each one just a few centimeters in thickness. This upper bed has ripples in here. These are climbing ripples migrating up the back of each other. They overlay a thin parallel laminated interval. So parallel lamination representing high velocity into ripples representing lower velocity into siltstones and mudstones above representing lower velocity still. So this would be an example of a low density turbidity current. This bed at the bottom has a similar vertical succession, but here you can see that there's what we refer to as lode structures. So some of the sand at the base of the bed has sunk down. It's denser, it's sunk down into some of the underlying mudstones, which are poorly compacted during deposition. And that gives rise to these lode structures. Okay, so just to summarize some of that, typically, I talked through the Baumer sequence already, but let me just refer to it again. This bottom left would be a high density turbidite which has all the different components of the Baumer sequence, and the Baumer sequence is a classical model we refer to for a turbidite bed. TA at the bottom, that represents structureless sandstone. TB, that's parallel laminated sandstone formed under high flow velocities, upper flow regime. Then ripples, then that's the TC. TD is parallel laminated siltstones, so representing low velocities, and then TE is mudstone really representing deposition in between these gravity flow events. Now, low density turbidites, like the two examples I showed you in this last picture, they don't show the full A, B, C, D, E division, or they don't necessarily show that, particularly if they're thin beds in relatively distal settings far from the source of the bed. So you see current ripples at the base, the C division, parallel laminated silts, the D division, and then mudstones, the E division. So we tend to lack the coarser components of the Baumer sequence. Okay, debrites. Well, a classical debrite, if we have a mixture of sand, mud, gravel, coarser grained material, that's all mixed in together and is structureless. If we start off with clean sand, we tend to see structureless sand. And of course, there are beds which are somewhere in between classical debrites, classical debris flows, and classical turbidity currents. Okay, so what I'm showing here is a map at the top and then a series of vertical sections at the bottom through a geologically recent gravity flow, which has been monitored and then cored um, offshore of West Africa, offshore of Morocco. So this is recent. It's a few thousand years old. This bed. The key thing here is that the red arrows show the flow direction for that flow. In places there's no deposition. In other words, all the sediment is bypassed further into the basin. There are parts of that flow where we have turbidity current deposited in yellow. There are some parts where we have a debris flow deposited in blue. And that change in the flow type, again, that reflects differences in the velocity of different parts of the flow. It represents deposition, so losing sediment and how that might cause the flow to then develop, or erosion, which then adds sediment, or they're mixing in, incorporating more water into the flow. If we look at some of these vertical sections through here, that's what's shown at the bottom, all through one bed. Here's where the deposit is very thin. We have mainly bypass. So the sediment just moves, carries further to the left into the basin. And then there are places where we have, debris flow beds. But again, they transition within the same bed into an overlying and underlying turbidity current. And there are places where we just have more classical turbidity currents. So the key thing here is that the type of flow, its behavior can change even within a single flow and therefore a single bed. This model shows the same kind of thing. This is based on extensive description of cores from the Britannia field in the North Sea. So here we're seeing an example of a cartoon of what is a flow which is largely a turbidity current, but at times it's carrying too much sediment to really be fully turbulent, and it behaves as one of these transitional flows halfway between a debris flow and a turbidity current. And that's referred to as a slurry flow in this particular case. The key thing is that behavior changes both spatially as we move laterally within the deposits of that flow, and it also changes through time as the flow moves over the bed, typically over the space of a few hours, for example. At the bed scale, that type of behavior can give us quite different properties within a bed. So that again, these are images of core photographs from the Britannia field. These are taken from some of the types of flows shown on this diagram in here. What we see is where we have this sort of slurry type behavior, we have sand and mud variably mixed within the same bed, and we can have pretty poor reservoir quality, millidarcy permeability, relatively low porosities. There are places in the flow or in the deposits which are closer to classical turbidites. They still have this banding within them, which is characteristic of a change from turbulent to laminar flow. But in this case, because these are closer to being fully turbulent flows, we have higher porosities and higher permeabilities. Okay, so that was a review of the processes that control one particular bed. So this area in here. Let's now think about how those beds stack up into elements and then into systems. And the key thing here is I'm going to show you examples of, for example, channels and other types of geometries. The key thing is those are made up of lots and lots of stacked beds. We're not just thinking about this forming during one gravity flow, but maybe over the course of hundreds or thousands of gravity flow events. So what kind of geometries do we see? Well, we see channels. At the sides of some channels, we have elevated boundaries referred to as levees, and those levees are thick close to the channel, they thin away from the channel, and they define a wedge. Some channels, we don't have these raised areas, but instead we have a gradual change from the channel axis and gradual thinning towards the sides associated with a flat top. And these tend to be referred to as wings. We also see more sheet-like deposits. Sheet is used as a pretty general term in description. What's also good, if we can, is to specify what the lateral extent of the sheet is. Is that 100 meters wide, a kilometer wide, 10 kilometers, etc. We also get lobe shapes. Those are sometimes referred to as splays. They have channels in their inner part, and then the flow leaves the channel and it spreads out to give us this lobe or teardrop shape. These can occur at the end of channels, or they can also occur maybe where a small channel cuts through the side of a big channel and, lateral to a channel, essentially. We also have mounded geometries as well, so positively raised topographic features. And those different elements, those different geometries are arranged or stacked in a certain way. And I'll show you some specific examples of that a little bit later on. But channels, for example, they often cut into and pass laterally into sheets. For example, channels can also be stacked into larger scale features. And again, there's a hierarchy within many deep water deposits. Similar elements of different sizes that we recognize depending on the kind of data we're working with. Okay, so back now to our typical fan system, deep water fan system. Channel through a canyon, exiting the canyon and feeding the fan itself, which is made up of several smaller channels with lobes at the end of them. If we think about the deposits here on the slope itself, well, you can see schematically in here we're seeing these are the scarps of faults. So we might, for example, have slide blocks. We can have slumps in here. That's what this is showing. Slump deposits. A listostrome is an old-fashioned word for slides, basically. We then look at, we then look at the fan itself. We can see we have lobes, we have channels. Those are the two recurring elements within the fan itself, the fan of this sort of pale yellow shading. Typically, as we go from the outer part of the fan up into the middle part of the fan, we start off with lobe deposits, which tend to have sheet-like geometries. And as we go from the outer part of a lobe to the inner part of a lobe, we get beds which are thickening upwards and an overall upward increase in sand content, with channels capping and cutting into those lobe deposits. So the lower fan, that's the outer part here, is really characterized by the lobe. The middle part of the fan in here is characterized by a mixture of channels and lobes. And then the inner part of the fan in here, we're just seeing in channel systems in here. We can also think about the basin plane deposits, so really the fringes of the fan. And in that case, we're really seeing, just a very few thin gravity flow event beds that make it that far away from the source of sediment, and mainly mudstones, pelagic mudstones deposited from suspension. Okay, so those are the basic motifs of deep water fans. One key control on the geometry and the scale of the fans is the grain size that we're supplying. So the key thing here is that if these fans are being supplied by lots of sand or by gravel and pebbles, that might be common in tectonically active areas with just narrow shelves. They tend to produce small fans. It's hard for gravity flows to transport that grain size of sediment over long distances. So we have small systems, typically tens of kilometers. The lobes are sort of amalgamated together. They're often difficult to distinguish from each other. and the channels are pretty short and poorly developed. The other extreme is a mud-rich system. So in this case, we have, channels are very long. They can the flows can be transported long distances. Even the individual branching channels are also very distinct from each other, and the lobes are separate from each other, and they're nice and clearly distinct. These mud-rich systems can be very large. We can be talking about thousands of kilometers for their downstream distance. And then we have mixed fans, so carrying a mixture of sand and mud, maybe 50% of each. These tend to have intermediate scale, so maybe in the order of several tens to hundreds of kilometers. The channels are distinct from each other and the lobes at the end, but the channels tend to be, they're shorter distances than they are in mud-rich systems. So let me show you the same diagrams, but to the same scale, because the scales on these 3 block diagrams are very different. If we show those 3 types of fans at the same scale, this is what we see. Here's our sand-rich fan in the order of 10 kilometers. Here's our mixed sand mud fan in the order of 100 kilometers. And here's our muddy fan, the order of 1,000 kilometers. And this maybe gives you a sense about just how important the grain size is. So the key thing here, why is grain size important? Because it controls the efficiency of the flow, how far the flow can transport that sediment. Highly efficient flows, those would tend to be mud-rich. The sorting of the grains as the flow moves downstream. We can transport sediment long distances, and we tend to get good sorting of sediment in different parts of the fan system. Inefficient flows, those tend to be those which are very sandy or conglomerate rich. They only travel short distances. We have less potential to sort the sediment, so the sediment tends to be poorly sorted. Other differences in grain size. So here we're looking at some of the characteristics of channels. We have cross sections through sand or gravelly channels on the left, muddy channels on the right, and then channels carrying a mixture of sand and mud in the center. Sandy channels tend to be wide, shallow, so they have a high width depth ratio. They're not sinuous, they tend to be fairly straight, although they can branch a little bit like braided river channels. So they have a low sinuosity. We tend not to develop levees, so levees are absent. And these channels migrate laterally. They have a low stability. They can migrate laterally relatively straightforwardly. At the other extreme, muddy channels, for example, these ones in here, they tend to be deep and narrow. So that gives us a low width to depth ratio. They have levees, these raised areas associated with the sides. So levees are well developed. And these channels, if we look at them in map view, they can be highly sinuous. I'll show you some examples of that in some of the later slides. And these channels tend to be stable. They tend to stay sort of fixed in the same position. So in a cross section, we often see them stacking up vertically, maybe shifting their lateral position slightly from each other. We can think about the same kind of effects associated with lobes. So again, we have a sandy or gravelly system on the left and a muddy system on the right. The key thing here is that in a sandy or muddy system, these lobes tend to be small. They tend not to be very wide and have small areas, and they have pronounced mounded relief at their top surface. In contrast, in muddy systems or systems characterized by a mixture of sand and mud, those lobes tend to be wider, they cover larger areas, and they have a lower relief. So these look more like sheet-like features than mounds. Okay, so grain size is important. Let's just sort of round off this section by me showing you some examples of different parts of a fan system, from the slope through these channels and into the fan itself and the lobes, which are the most distal parts of those fan systems. So what we're looking at here is a seismic image. It's a 3D image, but taken from a rather sort of odd angle. And you're looking directly into the slope. The colors in here represent thickness. So thickness in two-way time. So the shelf we're looking at the top of the picture, and then the slope is what we're seeing sort of down over most of the image. The warm colors in here, these record a shelf edge delta. That's where the source of the sediment feeding this fan is located. And you can see there are, areas of instability where there's been some collapse of the shelf edge, and that's associated with channels on the slope passing into deeper water towards the bottom of the image. So these are not confined within the canyon. These are, if you like, single-story channel systems, and you can see these look relatively sinuous in here. Other images are maybe of more classical canyons. So these are images of shallow Pleistocene canyon systems. So in cross section we have deep erosion. Typically canyons tend to be hundreds of meters in vertical thickness. They're big enough features that we can often map them very clearly in seismic data. If we look at a map view, so really taking a slice near the top of this canyon in here, what we tend to see is that, in the sides of a canyon, we have these sort of spoon-shaped features with the yellow dots around them. Those are sort of collapse features, so where the sides of the steep canyons have collapsed in and fed sediment into the canyon itself. And in this case, the flow direction is towards the bottom right. And here's a 3D image, showing a combination of the cross section and also the plan view for this particular canyon system. If we look at canyons in well-logged data, we're jumping around a bit. This is an example from the Paleocene of the northern North Sea. There are shelf deposits on top, basin floor, sandy basin floor fan deposits on the bottom, and the grey interval in the middle is the slope. And you can see within here, these wiggly lines are defining the bases of canyon systems. So there are two kind of clearly defined canyon systems, this one in here, this one in here. These well correlations are really tied to seismic data. That's how we know how to connect up the wells in this correlation panel. But you can see some parts of the canyons are sandy, some parts are muddy. So quite variation in terms of lithology. Here's an example of a sandy canyon fill, or part of a sandy canyon fill at outcrop. The cliff here is about 50 meters in height, and the white dashed line is showing the margin of a canyon here, a sandy conglomeratic canyon fill cutting into muddy, silicious mudstones. And if we look within that canyon fill, we can see lots of coarse sediment pebbles, for example, within debris flow beds, but even really coarse boulders in here. Again, these are predominantly debris flow deposits within this lower part of a sandy canyon fill. Going back to the subsurface, so this is an example of a sandy canyon fill. And if we zoom into the lower part of that canyon fill, again, we can see very coarse material transported along the floor of the canyon. Okay, so now let's think about sort of moving further into the basin. So these are all examples of sort of, if you like, some of the trunk feeder channels, and these are taken from examples of muddy deep water fan systems. So remember, muddy systems characterized by sinuous channels, low mobility, and well-developed levees. So here's a cross section showing a channel with levees, these raised areas off to the side, and you can see if we go down the section, we see that channel has stayed more or less in the same position as the section is built upwards. We take a cross section, sort of, so this is an oblique map view through here, and you can see the two levees in here. Those are those two levees in there, and you can see the sinuosity of that channel system. And this is a blow up from this larger image at the top in here. Okay, that channel does switch position. That's a process called avulsion. We'll talk about that a bit more in the context of rivers, but the channels do shift position through time. Here's another example. This is from a sandia system, part of the 40s fan, so early tertiary in the North Sea. This is a seismic amplitude map on the left, and then a line drawing of, based on that amplitude map on the right-hand side. The top left in here, this is the slope, and then the basin floor on the right-hand side. So if we ignore the slope for now, we look at the basin floor. You can see these brighter colors in here are predominantly associated with sand. They're defining, belts of sand, sometimes with clear channel systems. Sometimes it looks as though we have a number of channels kind of occurring at the same time or stacked laterally. And then the areas in between those channels associated with lower amplitudes. And this is the interpretation on the right-hand side here. Yellows equals more or less sand. Okay, we now think about, that channel as a passing down system into a lobe or a frontal splay. So here's a seismic cross section. Here is the base of the fan system, and above that we can see this low relief mounded feature in here. There are some internal reflectors within it, but this feature here is defining a lens shape, thick in the middle, thinning towards the sides. We look at that in map view. This is what we see. It's this teardrop shaped feature in here. It has a channel feeding it. That channel branches down dip, and these channels themselves branch even more finely down dip, and essentially those channels, as they branch and they move downstream towards the bottom right, they're getting thinner and they're passing into more sheet-like features within the context of this overall lobe geometry. When we look at outcrops through deep water fan lobes, this is typically what we see. So here you see a number of stacked sandstone beds with mudstones between them. Each one of these beds represents a single gravity flow event. And as we go from base to top, those beds are getting thicker. They're becoming more closely stacked, and that's recording that lobe building outwards. So we have the outer part of the lobe in here, the inner part of the lobe in here, and the whole succession is recording the building out or progradation of the lobe. In these examples as well, we also see low relief channels cut into the top of the lobe. So there's a little bit of folding in here, which is post-depositional. But here I'm looking at a sandy unit about 1 meter or so in thickness, and that sandy unit is thinning and pinching out towards the right. So this is a low relief channel. In the context of this seismic image, we're thinking about one of these very small channels, or even smaller, right near towards the middle or outer part of a lobe. Okay, that's a good place to take a break. So we'll stop there, and then we'll come back and think about sequence photographic models for deep water fan systems.